From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The fighting is ongoing in Kunduz. The situation is worrying, and many people have been displaced from their homes. When will this situation end? Our demand from the central government is to make this clear whether they should hand over the city to the Taliban or take full control by themselves and clear the whole area from insurgents so that we can live a peaceful life.
As U.S. forces withdraw from Afghanistan after almost 20 years of war and occupation, Taliban fighters advance across the country. We'll go to Afghanistan to speak with Malalai Joya, the youngest person ever elected to the Afghan parliament before she was suspended for denouncing warlords and war criminals. Then to South Africa, where thousands have been arrested in demonstrations against poverty, inequity, and the jailing of the former president, Jacob Zuma.
It's not about Zuma or what was. It's about poverty, my sister, that you cannot dodge. People are hungry. There are no jobs. We cannot dodge.
And we'll look at how the pandemic has fueled a sharp increase in the number of people going hungry around the world. 1/10 of the global population were undernourished last year. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Another punishing heat wave is set to bring triple-digit temperatures to at least 17 million people in the western United States and Canada this weekend as a record wildfire season fueled by the climate crisis shows no sign of letting up. In Oregon, the massive bootleg fire has burned more than 200,000 acres. Over 1 million acres of the western U.S. and Canada are now in flames. This is Dale Kuntz, head of the Cascades region of the American Red Cross.
What we've seen is the Red Cross is really this change from a one big event a year or one big event every 5 years or 10 years to now we're seeing chronic events.
In northeastern Washington state, hundreds of residents of the Colville Indian Reservation were forced to evacuate after a wildfire sparked by lightning grew rapidly. Washington Governor Jay Inslee said Wednesday climate change is to blame.
Every part of our state is under attack. Every person in some way is under attack from the combined effects of climate change that is today ravaging our state.
In Russia, the Kremlin has ordered heavy-lift military aircraft to join firefighting efforts as massive wildfires scorch northeastern Siberia. A heat wave and strong winds have left about 2 million acres of Siberian forest and tundra burning. This week, yet another heat wave broke records in western Russia, with high temperatures in Moscow forecast to approach 90 degrees Fahrenheit each day throughout the weekend. Global COVID-19 cases and deaths are on the rise, fueled by chronic outbreaks in Latin America and surging cases in Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The World Health Organization is warning of exponential increases in infections in Libya, Iran, Iraq, and in Tunisia, where medical workers report they've run out of oxygen and beds for coronavirus patients.
Now, we don't have any vacant place to receive any patients. We are waiting for someone to die to leave their place for the next patient. In fact, the situation is catastrophic. The number of patients outside waiting for a place in the emergency room is huge. Where will we put them?
Indonesia continues to set daily records of infections, deaths, and hospitalizations, and has overtaken India as the region's biggest COVID hotspot. Malaysia has logged a third straight day of record infections. Meanwhile, in Paris, French police fired tear gas to disperse crowds of protesters who marched against President Macron's plan to require a health pass for those gaining entry to bars, restaurants, and cinemas. People would be required to show proof of vaccination or a recent negative coronavirus test result. And in Greece, more than 5,000 anti-vaccine protesters rallied in Athens Wednesday against the country's mass vaccination program. The Centers for Disease Control says U.S. drug overdose deaths skyrocketed to a record 93,000 last year, a nearly 30% increase as the pandemic took hold. That's the largest one-year increase ever recorded. Overdoses rose in 48 of 50 states, fueled by methamphetamine and powerful opioids, including fentanyls. Overdoses accounted for more deaths in 2020 than car crashes, gun violence, and HIV/AIDS combined. President Biden has nominated a doctor who oversaw West Virginia's response to the opioid epidemic to head the Office of National Drug Control Policy. If confirmed by the Senate, Rahul Gupta would become the first medical doctor to serve as so-called drug czar since the position was created in 1988. Dr. Gupta also previously served as chair of the West Virginia Medical Cannabis Advisory Board, where he touted the medicinal benefits of marijuana. Senate Democratic Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has proposed draft legislation that would remove marijuana from a federal list of controlled substances while paving the way for the drug to be taxed and regulated. The Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act would also expunge federal records of nonviolent marijuana offenders. Co-sponsor Senator Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, said it's the first time in American history the Senate Majority Leader is leading the call to end marijuana prohibition.
In 2019, there were more marijuana arrests than all other violent crime arrests combined, and the majority of those were for simple possession. This is a grievous reality. Lives are being destroyed every single day.
In Haiti, the head of security at the presidential residence was taken into custody and is being questioned, along with several other security personnel, as investigations continue into last week's assassination of President Jovenel Moïse. Colombian authorities are probing whether Dimitri Herard met with any of the Colombian suspects in the assassination when he traveled to Bogota in May. 2 more suspects were arrested Wednesday, including a former police superintendent, Gilbert Dragon, a close associate to Guy Philippe, who led the 2004 coup against then-President Jean-Bertrand Aristide and who's now imprisoned in the United States. The other arrested suspect, Ronaldo Corvington, runs a security company and is accused of harboring the men who raided Moïse's home and killed him. 18 Colombian nationals, many of them former military, and 5 Haitians are now in police custody. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration has confirmed one of the 2 arrested Haitian-American suspects had worked as a DEA informant. Cuba announced it'll allow incoming travelers to bring in unlimited food, medicine, and hygiene products without having to pay a customs tax. The move comes after several days of rare anti-government demonstrations with people decrying the lack of medicines and basic goods, which is due in large part to the catastrophic U.S. blockade. A warning to our audience, this headline contains graphic footage of violence. Taliban forces say they've captured a key border crossing with Pakistan as they continue to make territorial gains, and with the U.S. and NATO withdrawal nearing its end. Taliban fighters say they are encouraging Afghan soldiers to surrender to the militant group.
Our request to the soldiers is to have mercy on themselves and surrender. Our order is a general amnesty, and they will be forgiven, and we will not face any problems. They have seen what we have done to them. Sometimes we have given them money and hung flowers around their neck.
Video emerged this week that appears to show Taliban fighters gunning down 22 Afghan soldiers as they surrendered last month in what Amnesty International has called a war crime. Intra-Afghan peace talks are expected to resume Friday, as early as Friday in Doha. After headlines, we'll go to Afghanistan to speak with the women's rights and human rights activist Malalai Joya. In Pennsylvania, the remains of 9 indigenous youth who died while at a government school over 100 years ago were turned over to their families Wednesday. The Carlisle Indian School was founded by an Army officer in 1879. Over 10,000 Native American children passed through its doors until 1918, where they were separated from their families and subjected to cultural genocide and neglect. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland participated in Wednesday's ceremony with members of the Rosebud and Oglala Sioux tribes. Holland, the first Native American cabinet secretary, is leading an investigation into the ongoing impact of these residential boarding schools and will seek to identify more burial sites across the country. Top U.S. General Mark Milley feared then-President Trump could attempt a coup to remain in power and compared Trump's rhetoric to that of Nazi Germany in the final weeks of his presidency. The revelations come in a new book by Washington Post reporters, which says Milley described Trump as a, quote, classic authoritarian leader with nothing to lose, unquote. Milley also reportedly called Trump's baseless claims of electoral fraud his very own Reichstag moment. Johnson & Johnson says it's recalling 5 of its aerosol spray-on sunscreen products after they were found to contain the carcinogen benzene. The recalled sunscreens are sold under the brand names Neutrogena and Aveeno. In North Carolina, the family of Andrew Brown Jr. has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit alleging officers who shot and killed the 42-year-old black father used unreasonable and excessive force in violation of Brown's Fourth Amendment rights. Brown was likely killed by a bullet to the back of his head in April after 2 sheriff's deputies opened fire on him in his driveway while serving an arrest warrant. A North Carolina prosecutor concluded the shooting was justified and said officers will not be charged. On Wednesday, family attorney Bakari Sellers said Brown did not get justice in life and is yet to find justice in death.
Andrew Brown's voice, District Attorney Womble, will be heard. Amen. Sheriff Wooten can't just run to Fox News. He's going to have to sit in front of us and have a deposition and answer the questions about why his officers violated their own policy about shooting into vehicles where no one poses a threat.
And Jamaica is planning to seek billions of dollars in reparations for slavery from Britain. Jamaica was a British colony from the mid-17th century until its independence in 1962 and remains part of the Commonwealth today. An estimated 600,000 Africans were brought to Jamaica as slaves. Olivia Grange, the Minister of Culture, Gender and Entertainment and Sports, told Reuters, quote, our African ancestors were forcibly removed from their home and suffered unparalleled atrocities in Africa to carry out forced labor to the benefit of the British Empire. Redress is well overdue, she said. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Nermeen Sheikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, as the United States continues to withdraw most of its forces from Afghanistan after nearly 20 years of war and occupation, Taliban fighters in Afghanistan said Wednesday they'd seized a major border crossing with Pakistan as part of a rapid advance across the country. This comes after 22 members of the Afghan elite special forces were reportedly massacred by Taliban forces earlier this week. The commandos had surrendered and were unarmed. A Taliban delegation in Moscow said Friday the group now controls over 85% of Afghan territory and has surrounded population centers, captured a key Afghan border crossing with Iran, and holds more than 2/3 of Afghanistan's border with Tajikistan. All of this is happening, as President Biden said last week, the U.S. military will complete its withdrawal from Afghanistan by August 31st, nearly 2 weeks ahead of the previous September 11th deadline. On Wednesday, former Republican President George W. Bush responded with a rare criticism of U.S. policy in Afghanistan during an interview with the German news outlet Deutsche Welle.
I'm afraid Afghan women and girls are going to suffer unspeakable harm. I'm sad. And Laura and I spend a lot of time with Afghan women, and they're scared.
Well, for more, we go to Afghanistan to speak to a leading Afghan woman, Malala Joya. She's a women's rights activist and human rights activist who in 2005 became the youngest person ever elected to the Afghan parliament. In 2007, she was suspended for publicly denouncing the presence of warlords and war criminals in the Afghan parliament. She's also the author of A Woman Among Warlords, the extraordinary story of an Afghan woman who dared to speak out. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Malalai Joya. Thank you for joining us from Afghanistan. I was wondering if you could respond to President Bush's criticism of Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, particularly relating it to the condition of women. Have the condition of women improved after the last 2 decades of U.S. war and occupation there?
Hello, dear Amy and Nerman. Thanks for the interview, and hello to all listeners. As I was saying in the past as well, and repeating again, that catastrophic situation of the women of Afghanistan was very good excuse for U.S. and NATO to occupy our country. Unfortunately, they pushed us from the frying pan into the fire as they replaced the barbaric regime of the Taliban with the misogynist warlords who are, their nature seem like the Taliban. They physically changed, imposed on the destiny of Afghan people. That's why today millions of Afghans are suffering from insecurity, corruption, joblessness, poverty, and still most of Afghan women are the victim. No doubt that some project that they had for Afghan women and girls, some schools they built, especially in the big cities, for justification of their occupation, this criminal war in Afghanistan. But still now you see that rape cases, domestic violences, acid attacks, forced marriages, self-immolation, beat women publicly with lashes, stoning to death. This list can be prolonged, that these all women rights violation against women continues. And it was not enough that now that U.S. and NATO invite the terrorist Taliban in the name of the so-called peace reconciliation to join this non-democratic regime. It is clear that, again, the women of Afghanistan will be the most victims. As today, men and women of my country do not have liberation at all. And you may also hear just now that they are talking about so-called peace reconciliation with the Taliban, but these Taliban announced their declaration that they were saying through their declaration that when they come in power, the girls 15 years old and the widows below 45 years old, they will force marry their commanders with them. And it is only one example, while we have many other examples of their misogynist act against women, that their nature never changed. For example, that two 14 and 16 years old girls in Samangan province just recently in front of their mother, the commander raped brutally, and 9 years old girl, 2 babies in Kabul few months ago, they were raped. And this list can be prolonged. That's unfortunately the situation of the woman is a disaster. And now from one end, Afghan people are they are suffering awfully from the COVID-19, but from another end, they are suffering from insecurity, corruption, joblessness, poverty. In fact, in the past 20 years, U.S. and NATO, they doubled the sorrows and miseries of Afghan people. Around 1 million Afghans were killed in the past 20 years, and they even dropped mothers of all other bombs in our country, used white phosphorus cluster bomb, and polluted our environment. They corrupted our economy. The wave of asylum seekers itself is another strong evidence of the wrong policy of the U.S. and NATO in Afghanistan. And they changed Afghanistan to the center of the drag. There are now tens of thousands of orphans, widows, and disabled people we have, and millions of Afghans, over 3 million, that they are giving report officially that they are addicted. This list can be prolonged, that the result of this criminal war of the U.S. and NATO, that in fact the victim was ordinary Afghan people. That's why always I say is that it was better they changed this banner of the so-called war on terror to the war on innocent Afghan people. And now they prove that the U.S. government has inseparable bond with their lackeys like Taliban, not only warlords, as giving them amnesty to these misogynist, bloodthirsty humans, and try to bring them in power and sharing power with them, and even give the international recognition to these terrorists. No doubt that situation will be more disaster. And for years I have called for the withdrawal of the foreign occupation from our country. As I believe, no nation can donate liberation to another nation. Now it has been proved for our people as well that U.S. and NATO were not honest for them. And now from one end, U.S. and NATO, as their puppet regime is in power, continue to their barbarism against our people. From another end, the terrorist Taliban continue to their fascism, and ISIS and all these other terrorists. And no doubt that with the withdrawal of these foreign troops, for the short term, people will face more economic insecure problem. But for the long run, it is the interest of Afghan people, because they fed up from this kind of so-called democracy, as they give bad view about democracy to our people. And they again says this big lie, put dust on the eyes of the U.S. public, great people of the U.S. and around the world, that apparently actually that we are leaving from Afghanistan, but the puppet mafia corrupt regime remain in power, and they are supporting more these other terrorist brand of terrorists like ISIS, like Taliban, warlords, that each of these from these disaster situations try to catch their own fishes in our country. Anyway, that as long as the foreigner interfere in our country and with the Western and neighbor countries, there is no chance that people will breathe a little bit in peace.
And Manala, you've talked about these criminal warlords and the criminal mujahideen. Could you explain who are complicit with the present government of Ashraf Ghani and have been for the last 20 years with successive Afghan governments? Who are these criminal mujahideen who, in fact, are being armed by the Afghan government to fight the Taliban now?
They are now war know about some of them, as 20 years they were in power, like Abdullah, like Sayyaf, Muakkar, Khalili, Rabbani, who were killed by brother in creed like Taliban. And this list can be prolonged. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, this fascist man who his name was in the blacklist of the U.S., has a long list of the human rights, women rights violation. And he welcomed in Kabul like a groom and come in power as well in the name of the peace reconciliation, this terrorist man. It's another example that by these terrorists never come peace or democracy, women rights in our country. The name of these warlords, they're all those, most of them who are in power, and also some Western technocrat who compromise with them because of the dollar and because of the position, high position and chairs that they have, unfortunately. And that's why situation of Afghanistan is very disaster today. And the only demand of Afghan people is that they must come to the court, they must be prosecuted. Same about the Taliban. This so-called peace that U.S. and NATO is talking about is more dangerous than war. The result will make more unite the sworn enemies of democracy, peace and justice, and also more wars will be released on the destiny of Afghan people. Peace without justice is meaningless. The only demand of Afghan people is justice. And our people divide the Mujahideen into two parts. One is most people of Afghanistan fight it against Russian invasion. They are real Mujahideen. They are heroes. But a small party, these about 8 fundamentalist extremist parties that their leaders now in power. Some name of them I mentioned, you can see in Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and many book has been written, Eyes for Infidel, Goes for Bleeding Afghanistan, my book, this list can be prolonged, that today war know about them. Now they are in power, and all of them, the warlord, the ISIS, the Taliban, their nature is same, and all fighting for the same bone, like dogs, bone of the power. Hopefully do not be installed to the dogs. Anyway, our people really fed up from this disgusting criminal policy of the U.S. and NATO, who are responsible for the current disaster situation of my country. If they are honest for Afghan people, when they are leaving the country, they should take all their lackeys, these bunch of puppets and these terrorists with themselves. They have no motivation to fight, but just because of the dollar, because of the money, and because of their foreign master, they are killing our people, still continue to their barbarism, terrorism against our people. In fact, terrorism itself was a big toll in the hand of the U.S., NATO, and neighbor countries use it for their own interest, for their own strategic policies. And the people of Afghanistan are the victim. And these terrorists never want to lose these terrorists. I'm giving you an example about the Taliban. In the past 20 years, they played the game of Tom and Jerry with these terrorists. One day, divide these terrorists to two parts, moderate Talib, extremist Talib. It makes no sense. Or another day, for example, recently, they released 5,000 terrorist Talib from the jail. It is clear that most of them join again the rank of the terrorist Taliban, continue as they joined. And also, that many other examples that we have, according to the game of Tom and Jerry, that I said they are not serious to defeat these terrorists. Some commander of the Taliban, leaders of the Taliban, like Mullah Mutawakkil, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, Mullah Rahmatullah Hashimi, this list can be prolonged, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, all they had key posts in Kabul, safe life in the safest area, all expenses the government paid. Never they regret from their past, at least to say apologize to Afghan people, while our people want them to come to the court. Or this non-democratic government called these terrorists the center brothers, when they are doing suicide attacks and shed the blood of the innocent people. And from this disgusting disaster situation, all these terrorists also misuse. For example, they are paying for their fighters $600 per month because millions of Afghans now suffering from the joblessness. They only had some super infrastructure project for justification of their occupation that now again Taliban are destroying every day. But infrastructure project that to create job for Afghan people, they never worked on this because they don't want Afghanistan to stand on its own field. For example, they didn't build factories and many other examples that we have like this. Anyway, that they are not honest for Afghan people, and now they betray the destiny of Afghan people. How? Well, they are doing deals with these terrorist Taliban. As they have one of their deal is that they should not attack the terrorist Taliban, do not attack their troops, the foreign troops. Even Puppet Ghani recently confessed that in the past 4 years, 45,000 Afghan security forces were killed, only 70 foreigners were killed. And also, now in the name of, as I said, in the name of peace, reconciliation, bring them in power to betray the peace, and many deals that they have with them, and not only with the U.S. and also these other neighbor countries. As for example, now they are going to give the control of the airport of Kabul to the non-democratic dictator regime of Erdogan, who is supporting created ISIS and want to exporting in Afghanistan more, and the terrorist Taliban against this act. And we have many examples like this that they don't want to have Afghanistan situation. I mean that stability to come in Afghanistan because of their own dirty agendas that they have in our country. And I have many other examples of their...
Malalai, I'm just going to interrupt to say, as the U.S. troops leave, what message do you have for the American people after for the United States' longest war in its history? And for President Bush, who is the one who led the war into Afghanistan, who said that he and his wife Laura did it for partly for the safety and security of Afghan women.
These are shameless lies. These are big lies that today, fortunately, it became like an open secret for the great people of the world as well. In fact, they wasted the blood of their soldiers, their taxpayer money. Not only they betrayed Afghan people, the blood of Afghan people has no value for them, has now put more fuel in the fire in this situation by supporting these extremist terrorists. No doubt that they must come to the International Criminal Court for the war crime that they committed. All these warmongers, criminal Bush, that Obama, that racist, fascist Trump, and now the Biden, who follow this disgusting criminal policy that they don't care about the wishes of Afghan people, how much they are tired. No doubt that the people thirsty for the peace, but this is not peace. This is more dangerous than the war. They push Afghanistan more toward dark ages. Not only the situation of Afghanistan, what they did here, the war crime they committed, they waged this criminal war to Syria, to Libya, to Yemen, to Ukraine, to Palestine. What they are doing is heart-wrenching. This list can be prolonged. Not only the terrorists in Afghanistan, the ISIS, Jihadi, Taliban that they are supporting, also the Boko Haram, the Abu Sayyaf and Al-Nusra. This list can be prolonged, that these other terrorist groups that the
Malalai, we just have 10 seconds. You continue to name names, as you did in the Afghan parliament, as the youngest person ever elected there, and then you were thrown out. What gives you the courage to continue to do this as you remain in Afghanistan?
Yes, the truth itself is enough to give me courage, the support of my people, these voiceless, suffering people of Afghanistan, the solidarity of the justice-loving great people of the world, that when we want the withdrawal of the troops, but we are asking in the meantime for the solidarity of anti-war movement, peace-loving, justice-loving, secular movement, feminist movement, that they should not leave Afghan people and do not allow them to forget again Afghanistan, and as these terrorists that bring them in power in this war they imposed on the destiny of Afghan people. We have no other way except to do a struggle. From your tribune, I ask my people, men and women, that as I believe in equal rights, that this is the time that we put the second-hand issues aside, all together to be united and organized to fight for our country. Because, again, I repeat and insist that no nation can donate liberation to another nation. And this 20 years as another example that proved that foreigners were not honest for our people.
Malalai Joya, we thank you so much for being with us. Women, human rights activist in Afghanistan, youngest person ever elected to the Afghan parliament, suspended in 2007 for publicly denouncing the presence of warlords and war criminals in the Afghan parliament. She's author of A Woman Among Warlords, the extraordinary story of an Afghan woman who dared to speak out. Next up, we go to South Africa, where thousands have been arrested in demonstrations against poverty, inequity, and the jailing of the former president. Stay with us. By the legendary South African musician Sipho Shola. He's known as the village pope. He died today of COVID-19 related complications. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to South Africa, where police say the death toll from the ongoing protests and unrest has risen to at least 72. Over 3,000 people have been arrested since demonstrations erupted after former President Jacob Zuma began his 15-month jail sentence for refusing to testify in a corruption probe. Demonstrators expressed frustration with entrenched poverty and inequity as South Africa battles a devastating wave of COVID-19. Looters said they were motivated by financial hardship.
Not about Zuma or what. It's about poverty, my sister, that you cannot dodge. People are hungry. There are no jobs. We cannot dodge.
People were running around causing chaos and then saying they have no food, so they're going to get some. So I also did the same. I stole food. I won't even lie.
Now the South African government says it'll call up reservists for the first time in decades. The army is preparing to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers. For more, we go to Johannesburg, South Africa, to speak with Sithembile Mbete, a senior lecturer in political science at the University of Pretoria. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you explain the origin of this protest and what's happening now?
Thank you so much for having me. The origins of the protest really come from the imprisonment of the former president, Jacob Zuma, on the charge of contempt of court. He basically was instructed by the Constitutional Court to testify before the State Capture Commission, which is investigating charges of state capture and corruption during his term in office. Of course, the irony is that former President Zuma is the one who instituted the commission in the first place and who is instrumental in writing its terms of reference. However, he has refused since 2019 to appear before the commission because he has stated that the chair of the commission, the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, is compromised and should step down. And so the Constitutional Court, after he refused to appear before the Constitutional Court in varying court cases earlier on this year, they judged him to be in contempt of court and decided to institute a custodial sentence as punishment. So that's 15 months. And he went into prison last week, Wednesday night. And on Thursday and Friday, we began to see protests and acts effectively of economic sabotage, actually, initially, is what we saw in the main highway between KwaZulu-Natal and Durban, which is the main port in South Africa, and Johannesburg, which is the commercial center. We saw trucks that are traveling between those two cities being torched on Thursday and on Friday, as well as warehouses and other important economic infrastructure being torched. By the end of Friday and into Saturday, this had spread in KwaZulu-Natal province, which is former President Zuma's home province, to unrest, to mass unrest, and effectively what I would call food riots as people stormed different malls and big food retail outlets in order to take food from these places. Of course, you also saw more generalized looting as people were also stealing fridges and television sets and clothes and all of those kinds of items as well. And I think that the food riots we can certainly understand in terms of the deep levels of poverty and vast inequality that South Africa finds itself in. The expanded unemployment rate of the general population is about 46%. The unemployment rate for people under the age of 24 is 74.7% at the moment. So there is very high levels of unemployment. The government had been giving a social grant to people who are unemployed during the COVID-19 lockdown period of 350 Rand, which is about $24. But that was discontinued in March. And a vast number of people were reliant on that amount of money, as small as it is, to feed their families every month. And with the absence of that grant and the decision by the government at the beginning of July to extend COVID-19 lockdown regulations to level 4 and reduce economic activity, this was really a perfect storm that has built up, triggered by initially the imprisonment of former President Zuma. But as the people who were speaking in the segment have explained, really the protests and the unrest has stopped being about former President Zuma and has become more about the socioeconomic conditions that people find themselves in and the problems of hunger. And that's certainly what it is around the looting and the vandalizing of stores. Of course, what we've also seen in recent days in both KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, where Johannesburg is, but mostly in KwaZulu-Natal, is the destruction of key economic infrastructure. So water reservoirs, electricity substations, community radio stations in Johannesburg have been attacked, which is leading some to think that there is also a dimension of this that is far more deliberate and a lot more of a political attempt by those who support former President Zuma to undermine or overthrow the administration of the current President, Cyril Ramaphosa.
Sithembele, you just talked about the destruction of infrastructure and the way in which this unrest, as you say, has spread. Now, many have said that, in fact, this kind of destruction will, in the end, impact the poor more than anybody else. So if you could talk about that, and also the extension of this lockdown. South Africa now caught between these two impossible situations. On the one hand, rising numbers of COVID cases, and on the other hand, the devastating effects of the lockdown, where half of South Africa's population was already below the poverty line. And as you say, government assistance stopped in March.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So what we have seen, especially in township areas where people were destroying the retail stores and the malls, and this was really localized in KwaZulu-Natal and in Gauteng, and even then not all parts of Gauteng, mostly in Johannesburg. What we've seen is people in township destroying we've seen the destruction of the retail stores, of malls, and what that is leading to now is that there is a shortage of food in some areas, because the places where people would buy food are now closed and non-operational. And there is a broader concern that those were places that were employing people. As I've said, South Africa's unemployment rate is incredibly high. And so retail was really the area where most people were finding employment. And so those local employers in these different areas, many of them will never really be able to open. And so there will be many people who have lost their employment in different township areas around South Africa, and in areas like Soweto, where until the late 1990s, there wasn't really much infrastructure for people to be able to live and work and buy what they need within the township of Soweto, even though it has a population of around 2 million people. And so all of that infrastructure that has been developed over the past 15 to 20 years, much of it has been destroyed and may not be rebuilt. And so the people that are really going to feel the brunt of this in actually already in the short term, but certainly I think in the medium to long term, are the poorest South Africans who are already suffering so much under the economic circumstances of the country. And I do think that we need to distinguish between, and I'm self-correcting here, that although the people who were engaging in the food rights and taking the food and other goods from shops are not necessarily the people who were burning the infrastructure. And it seems as more information becomes available, as more intelligence comes out, that there were two different dynamics in this unrest. There is the, and I would say, legitimate cause of people who are hungry and who are economically marginalized. But it seems then the other destruction, the burning, seems to have been done by people with a greater political purpose. And the government really does not seem to have many solutions for how to deal with the underlying causes of what we have seen. Because I really believe that the imprisonment of former President Zuma last week and all the disgruntlement around it would not have turned into the kind of conflagration that we've seen in the past few days if people were more economically secure. And the government, instead of reintroducing the assistance to people that was discontinued in March, has decided instead to deploy the army. As you say, more soldiers are being deployed than ever since 1994. And they've said that the cost doesn't matter. The Minister of Defense has basically been given a blank check by the National Treasury to deploy soldiers around the country. And this, to me, seems like a wrong-headed way to deal with this. If money really is not a problem, then that money should be used to provide greater support to the people, economic support and financial support to the people who need it. Because, as you say, we're facing these two, caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, COVID-19 and the Delta variant, which is spreading rapidly throughout the country and has caused a significant increase in deaths, especially deaths of the younger people. So people below the ages of 45 are dying at a far greater rate with this new variant. But, of course, the measures that have been put in place to limit the spread of the Delta variant have also undermined people's ability to engage economically and to make money for their families. And so the government has been looking at this very short-sightedly as a security problem and a security threat, where I think that a more sustainable solution would be found if the government looked more holistically at all the causes of this and in the immediate term, as an immediate solution, reintroduced some kind of financial relief to all South Africans who need it, and I think that in the longer term really considers looking at some kind of universal basic income, because in a situation where half your population is unemployed, there are no real other options about how to sustain people and to keep a socially healthy and productive society.
Sithembile, finally, we just have a minute. You've pointed out that, in fact, one of the driving grievances of these protests is the fact that life for most Black South Africans has remained more or less unchanged since the days of apartheid, and that this has been compounded by policies of the ANC government. Could you just talk about that briefly?
Yes, so, South Africa's famed peaceful transition, I think that was successful to some degree on the political front and in ending the immediate conflict that came with apartheid. But it really did nothing to change the underlying economic structure. And the reality is that the economy from 1948 and actually from before then was structured to exclude Black people. It was an economy that it was structured so that black South Africans would be a kind of permanent underclass, servicing the economy and the needs of white South Africans who would own assets, including land, etc. And what has happened since 1994 is that while a few black South Africans, I mean myself included, have been able to get education and break into the middle and upper classes, the vast majority of black South Africans remain excluded from the economy and unable to improve their conditions. And until we change the fundamental structure of our economy, I think we will continue to face the risk of this kind of unrest in the future.
We want to thank you so much for being with us. And I just want to add, and looking at South Africa, which has been leading the challenge to get vaccines throughout the poorest areas of the world, less than 3% of the population has been fully vaccinated. Compare that to almost 70% of people in the United States. Sithembile Bete, I want to thank you so much for being with us, Senior Lecturer in Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria in Johannesburg. Next up, as we talk about hunger in South Africa, we're going to go global and look at how the pandemic has fueled a massive increase in the number of people going hungry around the world. Stay with us. Fruit of the Trip by Tarika of Madagascar. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we look at how the COVID-19 pandemic's fueled a sharp increase in the number of people going hungry around the world. A new report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world found about 1/10 of the global population is undernourished last year. More than 2.5 billion people lacked access to sufficiently nutritious food. United Nations says 1 in 5 children around the world now face stunted growth. This is 25-year-old Zatina, who lives in a village in western Madagascar, has not been able to work during the pandemic. She has 3 children who are malnourished. She spoke to Al Jazeera English.
Without this aid, we would have died. We'd been eating plant roots, which gave us permanent stomach aches. As a woman, I personally no longer have enough energy to go and dig up those roots. Even men are unable to do so anymore.
For more on how COVID, as well as conflict and the climate crisis, are contributing to the rising level of hunger, we're joined by Saskia Depe, who is the World Food Programme's head of systems analysis for nutrition. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you lay out the findings, Saskia, of this global report?
Yes, good morning. Sure. So the global report shows that the increase of undernutrition, meaning hungry people, has really increased. We're up to 811 million in 2020. And that's a consequence, as you said, of conflict, of climate change and climate shocks, as well as the economic downturns, where it's really the COVID pandemic that has sparked a lot of that. And furthermore, there's a lot of malnutrition that comes with that. So a fifth of children with stunted growth, it's their growth and it's their development. So suffering malnutrition early in life has a prolonged effect throughout the rest of life. So it affects ability for schooling, it affects income earning as an adult, and it affects health, non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cardiovascular disease as an adult as well. So the consequences of the hunger and the malnutrition increase that we're seeing today is going to be long-term.
I want to go to the chief economist of the Food and Agricultural Organization, Maximo Torero, laying out the key findings also of this report.
We found that 720 to 811 million people around the world face hunger in 2020. This number is approximately 118 million more people that were facing hunger in 2020 with respect to 2019. What this means is that 418 million people are more undernourished in Asia, and around 282 million people are more undernourished in Africa. And in Latin America, we also seen an increase to 9.1% of the population being undernourished today. When we look at the real reasons behind hunger, always conflict, climate extremes, and economic downturns and slowdowns are the major reasons behind the increase in the hunger and the nourishment.
So Saskia, you talked earlier, and as did Maximo now, about undernourishment and the long-term effects of undernourishment, especially on children. Could you say how many children have been impacted by hunger or undernourishment, and what areas are worst impacted? Where are people the most hungry, or more people hungry?
So the largest number of hungry people is in Asia. The largest proportion of hungry people is in Africa. There are there's many children suffering acute malnutrition, and children can suffer that multiple times in a year or in their young life. And there's stunted children is around 22%, and it has increased because of COVID. And the projections are that also in 2030, we will still see the impact of the stunting, so the undernutrition early in life that's happening today.
And could you explain, Saskia, what is the hidden hunger, and what are the distinctions between a healthy diet and a sufficient diet, and how is that taken into account in the report?
Yeah, so the report reminds us that 3 billion people were unable to afford a healthy diet, and that's actually the case in 2019. And we're seeing an increase with at least 140 million people because of COVID now. And it's not only the number who cannot afford, but it's also the extent to which they cannot afford. So that healthy diet, a synonym for that would be a recommended diet. So it's a diet that gives us enough vegetables, fruits, a good variation of protein-rich foods. It's as food-based dietary guidelines tell us how to eat. And doing that at the lowest possible cost, that has been the benchmark for the 3 billion. Now, as I say, it depends to what extent you cannot afford such a recommended or healthy diet. So if you can only afford 50% of that, your diet is of much lower quality than if you cannot afford the last 10% of that cost benchmark. When you can only afford 50%, you'll have deficiencies of vitamins, of minerals, and you may not really notice it, but those affect like your energy levels, your brain development as a child. It affects many bodily functions, but you don't really feel hungry, nor do you look hungry. So that number of up to 811 million people hungry, beyond that, there's also many more people who suffer that hidden hunger.
So what is the World Food Programme's most important demand for dealing with this crisis of a tenth of the world hungry?
Yeah, so we are planning this year to reach 138 million people directly with our food assistance. So ensuring that they have better access to foods. Which comes in different forms. It comes in kind provision of food. It also comes in the form of cash, so that they can participate in the local market. And that brings us also to be engaged in food systems, in social protection systems, so to provide a way for the systems that people engage with on a daily basis to provide better for them and to also make a connect. So do you get some social assistance, for example, in the form of
we
cash?
have 2 seconds.
How can that cash be enough, and how can the food system have the right options available for you to purchase?
We have to leave it there. Saskia Dupay of the World Food Programme. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Be safe.